Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Lost World of the Old Ones, Discoveries in the Ancient Southwest, by David Roberts, narrated by Shawn Compton. Prologue. Waldo's Catwalk. For more than an hour, the three of us climbed the steep, trailless canyon wall, pushing through scratchy thickets of scrub oak and across exposed sandstone slabs. We had long since lost sight of the curious speck in the middle of the overhanging cliff that we had scoped with binoculars from the dirt road beside Range Creek 1,000 feet below us. That speck had been pointed out to us by Waldo Wilcox, the 75-year-old rancher who had spent his whole adult life on the 12-mile-long family spread in Range Creek, a tributary of the Green River in east-central Utah that carves a majestic chasm through the lofty Tavaputs Plateau. After years of exploring the backcountry of the Southwest in search of prehistoric ruins and rock art, Greg Child and I were used to this sort of scrambling, so we chose the approach route, keeping the location of the cliff toward which we were headed tucked in the backs of our minds. For archaeologist Renee Barlow, such an adventure was relatively new, so she went along with our pathfinding with only a modicum of second-guessing. It was a warm day in May 2005. Hiking in shorts and t-shirts, we were soaked in sweat. 54 years earlier, in 1951, only months after Waldo's parents had bought the ranch, his father Ray, known as Budge, his brother Don, and 21-year-old Waldo had stood on the same dirt road and argued about that speck in the distant cliff. "There's something there right in the middle of it," Waldo had said. "Some Indian thing." "Nah," countered Don, 5 years older. "It's natural, just rocks." Budge agreed. "Yep, rocks or ledges or something." The next year, in 1952, the Army drafted Waldo and shipped him to Japan. During his 2-year stint in the forces, he used field glasses for the first time. The tantalizing Indian thing on the high cliff was often on his mind, so he bought a cheap pair of Japanese binoculars and mailed them home. Back in Range Creek in 1954, he trained the instrument on the distant apparition. "They wasn't that good of field glasses," Waldo told me in 2005, "but I could see everything that was there. Sure enough, it was a big old granary halfway up this sheer cliff." One day Waldo tackled the arduous scramble to the foot of the cliff, following much the same route the three of us would pursue half a century later. Arriving at the base of the precipice, he was stunned at what lay before him. He could see the big old granary well, 65 feet above him. He could not imagine how to get to it. After a good long look at this prodigy of prehistoric architecture, he descended the 1,000 feet to the valley. Over the years thereafter, he kept his silence about what he had found. Budge and Don, less curious than Waldo about Indian things, never bothered to undertake the tricky bushwhack up the canyon slope to check out the granary for themselves. After the Wilcoxes had bought the Range Creek Ranch in 1951, they built sturdy gates on the old dirt road at either end of their property to keep out trespassers. Waldo's parents and his brother Don soon moved on to other ranches in the Tavaputs, while Waldo, his wife Julie, and eventually their 4 kids stayed on in Range Creek. For schooling, from September to May, the kids and Julie moved into the family's snug house in Green River, 35 miles away, while Waldo lingered on with his cows, the lonely lord of his outback estate. 1,000 years and more ago, Range Creek had teemed with part-time hunter-gatherers who also raised corn, beans, and squash. These ancients are known to science as the Fremont people, northern neighbors of the Anasazi, or Ancestral Puebloans. Still poorly understood. We have no idea, for instance, what became of the Fremont after they vanished entirely from the archaeological record around AD 1500. The Fremont pose one prehistoric conundrum after another. For 50 years, everywhere Waldo wandered in Range Creek, chasing stray cows or hunting bears and mountain lions, he stumbled upon Indian stuff. Potsherds, chert flakes left by arrowhead makers, manos and metates for grinding corn, rings of stones outlining the shallow pit houses in which the Fremont lived, dizzy granaries on cliff ledges where they stored their precious grain, and even the graves of the long dead. Unlike so many ranchers in the West, for whom collecting and hoarding artifacts is a time-honored tradition, Waldo left virtually everything he found in place and undisturbed. "It's the way I was brought up," Waldo said to me in 2005. "Mom and Dad always told me that just 'cause we owned the land didn't mean the Indian stuff belonged to us. They wouldn't go to the cemetery and dig folks up just for the gold in their teeth." In 2001, with a heavy heart, Waldo succumbed at last to the limitations of old age and sold his ranch to the Trust for Public Lands and the state of Utah. Eventually, the property landed under the aegis of the state's Division of Wildlife Resources, DWR, some of whose functionaries cherished visions of returning Range Creek into a prime bighorn sheep hunting reserve with a blue-ribbon trout stream running through its heart, even if that might have required cutting down all the pinyon and juniper trees in the canyon to improve the habitat. In the meantime, however, archaeologists got a look at Range Creek. Uniformly astounded, the experts agreed that Range Creek had the potential to tell us more about the Fremont than had the combined efforts of the 70 previous years of research since the culture had been identified. Keeping Range Creek a secret for 3 years, an archaeology team out of the Utah Museum of Natural History, UMNH, started to make a systematic survey of the canyon's glories. But a local newspaper leaked the story in the summer of 2004, touching off a wildfire of national media coverage and a furor among Native Americans from New Mexico to Nevada who were royally pissed off to have been kept in the dark about a hidden valley that, some of them insisted, might have been part of their own ancestral heartland. Mesmerized by the news about Range Creek, I got magazine assignments from National Geographic and National Geographic Adventure. Afire with a passion to explore this unknown wilderness, I made a phone call to Greg Child that put the match to his kindred ambitions. In Price, we met Renee Barlow, co-leader of the UMNH team, who at once welcomed us to join her on her prowls through Range Creek. As climbers, Greg and I could get Renee to places none of the UMNH team could reach on their own. On our first visit to the remote valley, Greg and I recognized that while the creek bottom abounded in sites and artifacts, all the most spectacular ruins lay in high eyries that would be extremely hard to get to. Oddly enough, Renee was the only member of the team who shared Greg's and my ambition to explore those inaccessible sites. None of them exerted a more powerful allure than the speck in the overhanging cliff 1,000 feet up the west side of the canyon that Waldo had spotted in 1951 and scrambled up to 3 years later. In the 51 years since his jaunt, no one else had visited the big old granary Waldo had discovered. That May morning, at last we reached the ledge on the same level as the base of the overhanging cliff. We traversed to the right around a corner. Greg stopped in his tracks, stared up, and said softly, "My mind is blown." As Waldo had reported, a 25-foot-long trunk of dead Douglas fir leaned against the cliff, directly below the granary. It was apparently a Fremont ladder, still in place at least 650 years after it had been placed there. Breaching an otherwise featureless cliff inclined only a shade less than vertical, the trunk looked far too spindly to climb. Even more daunting, the big old granary, actually a pair of granaries sharing a common wall, hovered a good 40 feet above the tip of the fir tree, and those 40 feet were relentlessly overhanging. And above the double granary, the cliff soared for another 90 feet at an even steeper overhanging angle. The lip of the cliff, 150 feet up, loomed dizzyingly in space as we craned our necks to study the Fremont wonder. Above the tip of the Douglas fir, a thin crack split a pair of arching overhangs. That crack had evidently been the ascent line of the daredevil who had pioneered the route, for halfway between the treetop and the granary, a hefty stick had been jammed endwise into the fissure, like a huge wooden piton. The stick might have been the key to reaching the hand and footholds on the cliff above. The double granary, whose main storage bin stood a good 4 to 5 feet tall, was perched on the skimpiest of ledges. 15 feet to the right, lower on the slanting ledge, its base secured by rocks mudded in place, an improbable triangular cantilever of heavy logs extended into the empty air. "That crack's gotta be 5'11" on crumbly rock," Greg murmured, eyeing the route as he graded it at a rating that only top climbers today could accomplish. Greg, who has reached the summits of K2 and Everest, put up new routes on El Capitan, and pioneered fierce new lines on desert towers, is one of the best climbers of his generation worldwide. But he could not imagine tackling the route in front of us, even with the nylon ropes and cams and nuts we had hauled up to the cliff. Renee was as dumbfounded as we were, blurting out, "Wow," and "Oh my gosh," every few seconds. I contributed my own exclamations of astonishment. All of us were thinking the same thing. It was mind-boggling enough to imagine the best Fremont climber of his era soloing the route to the ledge. But once there, how had he and his cronies hauled up stones and mud and timbers, built the double granary, then figured out a way to hoist, store, and later retrieve the precious grains the storage bins must have held? And why? Why so incredibly difficult and dangerous a place to hide your food? On the spot, Renee named the double granary Waldo's Catwalk. Our only hope of getting to it was to circle left, scramble to the top of the cliff, and try to rappel down to the site. An hour later, Greg tied our ropes to a pair of pinyon pines and threw the ends off the precipice. Then, one by one, we rappelled the 150-foot cliff. Beyond the lip, however, we dangled in space, spinning like spiders from their silken threads. When I reached a point in midair just above the pair of granaries, I got a great view of the site. The doors of the storage bins, flat slabs of sandstone shaped to fit, lay intact, closing the rooftop orifices that were the only entrances to the granaries. But I hung now far out from the cliff face, a good 20 feet beyond even the protruding cantilever of logs. Suspended in the air on a rope, a climber has no way to generate the momentum to swing in toward the cliff. All I could do was stare at Waldo's catwalk. As I slid on toward the ground, I was reconciled to defeat. We would not be able to reach the astounding prehistoric ruin. But Greg was of another mind. He urged us to leave our climbing gear on the ledge and come back for another try 2 days later. He still had a trick or two up his sleeve. In 1996, I published a book called In Search of the Old Ones. It was the fruit of more than 7 years of exploring the canyons and mesas of the Southwest, centered on the Colorado Plateau, a vast and beautiful region that encompasses southern Utah, northern Arizona, southwestern Colorado, and western New Mexico. National parks such as Mesa Verde, devoted to the dwellings of the ancients, had left me cold. Even such lordly villages as Cliff Palace seemed embalmed as Park Service dioramas. Instead, I set out, both solo and with a handful of like-minded aficionados, to find my own ruins and rock art in obscure corners of the backcountry. At the same time, I interviewed as many of the leading southwestern archaeologists as I could, hoping to leaven the romance of my vagabondage with the solid analyses of the experts who studied the Native Americans who had left behind the abandoned dwellings and the enigmatic pictograph and petroglyph panels that abound all over the Southwest. The book seemed to fill a niche, somewhere between such rigorous academic surveys as Linda Cordell's Prehistory of the Southwest and lyrical evocations of the landscape such as Edward Abbey's Desert Solitaire. One of my chapters was titled In Praise of Cedar Mesa. My own paean to the glories of the 400-square-mile rectangle of Bureau of Land Management, BLM, terrain in southeastern Utah that enfolds the richest array of unrestored ruins and rock art in all the Southwest. I opened the book with an account of a 4-day backpack I had undertaken alone in late October 1993 into one of the canyons on Cedar Mesa, during which I saw not another soul. On the 3rd day of that outing, I scrambled up a devious route to the north rim of the canyon, then circled east to explore a modest 5-room complex that was hidden from almost every vantage point, except the opposite south rim, from which I had spotted it the day before. From above, it wasn't easy to find that ruin, tucked as it was under a series of protruding cliffs, but at last I did so. I spent more than an hour there, marveling at the canny architecture. Shaped sandstone blocks mortared together with mud in which I could see the fingerprints of the builders, as well as fondling potsherds and chert flakes that lay scattered on the ground in front of the site. Before heading back to camp, I walked the ledge on which the ruin lay to see if there were any other artifacts or structures left behind by the old ones. The ledge dwindled toward a dead-end seam. I was about to turn back when I suddenly saw, below me on the left, a large, intact ceramic pot, decorated in the style called corrugated. The pot had been nestled inside a recessed stratum of marly rock, a natural hiding place. Its owner, I mused, had placed it there sometime in the 13th century A.D., intending to come back and retrieve it, but she never did. Was I the first person to find the vessel in more than 700 years? I had found a few intact pots in remote canyons before, but never one so perfect as this. In my book, I evoked the emotions that my discovery had sent tingling from my shoulders down my spine, and in the photo insert, I included a picture of the pot in situ. In Search of the Old Ones is still in print, 19 years after it first appeared. The book has sold well, and I'm told that it seems to have acquired the status of a minor cult classic. Strangers have come up to me in Bluff, Utah, or Page, Arizona, and thrust well-thumbed copies of the book into my hands, asking me to autograph them. Yet the book also provoked a backlash. In my prologue, I did not name the canyon in which I had found the pot, or give any hints, so I thought, to the location of the nearby 5-room ruin. The last thing I imagined was that readers would turn In Search of the Old Ones into a treasure map. But that's what happened. Folks started showing up at the Cane Gulch Ranger Station on Cedar Mesa, my book open to the photo of the corrugated vessel, demanding, "How do I get to Roberts's pot?" Quite aside from the fact that BLM policy forbids them to direct hikers to prehistoric sites on Cedar Mesa, the Cane Gulch Rangers were flabbergasted and annoyed by these new demands. Not surprisingly, they blamed the messenger, me. One evening, my good friend and companion on many a Cedar Mesa prowl, Von Haydenfeld, was debating the merits of Old Ones with one of the longtime Cane Gulch ranchers. That fellow summed up his viewpoint in a pithy formula: "Tell Roberts to shut the fuck up." Other connoisseurs of Cedar Mesa, less naive than the ones who waved my book in the face of the Rangers, took my photo and the vague description of the canyon as a personal challenge. With sleuthing skills akin to those of Sherlock Holmes, some of them found their way to the ruin, and to the pot. They told their friends how to get there, who told their friends. Today, I'm informed, a beaten trail leads to the ledge on which the priceless vessel was stashed 7 centuries ago. The great fear, of course, is that someone will pry it loose and take it home to display on his mantle. Meanwhile, in the same month that my book was published, National Geographic came out with my article, The Old Ones of the Southwest. Included were 4 Ira block photos of Grand Gulch shot during an 8-day llama trek we took together from the government trail to Cane Gulch. The next time I applied for a permit to camp in Grand Gulch, a routine formality in the past, I was turned down. I traveled to Monticello to argue with the BLM official who had banned me from the finest of all the Cedar Mesa canyons. His argument was that by publishing an article in a national magazine and getting paid to do so, I was practicing as a commercial operator without a license. I countered, "So are you banning every photographer who's published a photo of Grand Gulch? David Munch? Tom Till? Bruce Hucko?" "We're in the process of doing so," the man claimed. "We're starting with you." In the end, I had to appeal the BLM fiat all the way to the Department of the Interior to get it overturned. In the meantime, I realized that the reaction of the Rangers stemmed from a deeply felt, but, in my view, poorly reasoned ambivalence that I had run across countless times in the Southwest. The sense that a magical place one has recently discovered should stay as it is, a secret shared only with one's fellow cognoscenti. In 1995, I had tackled this conundrum in an article called The Moab Treehouse. Hanging out in that appealing Utah town on the Colorado River, I had plunged into the endless debate over the resort's growing popularity. The old-timers who had lived in Moab through the uranium boom and bust of the 1950s were all for growth. As one of them told me, "I'm just glad I don't have to drive 100 miles to Grand Junction anymore to buy a 2x4. The environmentalist newcomers, on the other hand, decried Moab's slide toward, in their words, another Aspen or Santa Fe. I borrowed my title from the sardonic metaphor of one of the old-timers. "Some folks have found our treehouse. Now they want to pull the rope up." When I told my editor at National Geographic about the BLM fuss over Grand Gulch, she uttered a pronouncement that I have ever since clung to as a personal manifesto. "This is nonsense," she said. "If a thing is worth doing, it's worth writing about." Yet a genuine dilemma lies at the heart of this controversy. I am as dismayed as anyone when I go back to a splendid ruin that I discovered on my own, by accident, 20 years ago, when it was known to a small coterie of desert enthusiasts, only to find it swarmed over with chattering hikers who've been lured to the place by directions in a published guidebook or by GPS coordinates posted on an internet site. Yet I had to realize that I was as much to blame as anyone for the burgeoning popularity of Cedar Mesa. I had observed the code of the day among explorers of the prehistoric Southwest. If you commit your discoveries to print, be as vague as possible about their location, and emphasize again and again the conduct necessary to keep those sites pristine. Take home nothing, not even the tiniest flake or potsherd. Don't stand or lean on ruined walls. Don't touch the rock art, for the oils from human skin degrade both pigment and patina. It was not a code that had always held sway. Photos from earlier in the 20th century show visitors, including professional archaeologists, clambering all over the dwellings, even crawling across rooftops, chalking the petroglyphs to make the figures stand out for the camera, sawing off the ends of roof beams to get tree ring dates, and even taking metal axes to ancient hand and toe trails to enlarge the holds so that modern inquisitors could climb safely to high granaries. It was inevitable, I realized over the years, that a younger generation than mine would feel no qualms about giving precise hiking directions to the ruins and panels they had found, or posting photos on the internet complete with GPS coordinates. And I would discover in the years after 1996 that some members of that younger generation filled their pockets with potsherds and arrowheads, while others didn't hesitate to yank on fragile dwelling doorways as they lurched their way into dwellings, or allowed their dogs to romp inside ruins as if they were backyard playpens. The impact of my book is attested to in a quirky novel by Robert Gay called The Marauders, published in 2009. The heroes of this futuristic tale are a sextet of eco-terrorists bent on sabotaging a National Park Service project to pave a road to and build a visitor center around a new national monument celebrating, but keeping everyone at a distance from, Moon House, one of the finest of all the ruins on Cedar Mesa. Two of these self-styled marauders, Hayden and Rob, groan as they read the posts about Moon House on the internet. Says Hayden, Most all of these guys talk about how David Roberts' book inspired them to try and find it too. According to Gay, In Search of the Old Ones, somehow or another had managed to become the most popular pop book on the Anasazi. Devotees of the ancient Pueblo dwellers read it like the Bible, hanging onto every word. In it he described things that people today can no longer see. Thousands of hikers every year tuck the book into their packs when they head out there, reading passages from it by moonlight or headlamp. From Page to Panguitch to Pagosa Springs, where he went talking about his book, people filled up the provided auditoriums. Knowingly or not, a subject of some debate among his followers, Roberts appeared to be styling himself as the Anasazi's Ed Abbey. Rob demurs, "I like that book." But Hayden answers, "So do I, but I think it's become too well known. It's accelerating the destruction of its subject matter. I got my copy at Mesa Verde, for God's sake. It's pervasive across the Southwest." When I first read that passage, I was bemused. I thought briefly of writing a note to Robert Gay, described in the author bio as a guide, a wildlife biologist, and a paleontologist, who has lived in and explored the Southwest and the Colorado Plateau for over a decade, protesting that I've never spoken in Panguitch or Pagosa Springs, and that the Mesa Verde Visitor Center has never carried my book, apparently because of the pot shots I took in my opening chapter about the way the National Park Service administers its archaeological wonders. But I thought better of it. The Marauders, after all, is fiction. Was it true, however, that, as Hayden claimed, In Search of the Old Ones was accelerating the destruction of its subject matter? If so, should I, in the future, as Vaughn's ranger friend advised, shut the fuck up? My answer, embodied in this book, a sequel to In Search of the Old Ones, is no. When I research a book, I spend as much as 3 years immersing myself in the subject. It becomes an obsessive quest as I ransack, for instance, the archives of the Arizona Historical Society to find the 1915 interview with Tom Jeffords, the only white man who ever befriended Cochise, or hike into Davis Gulch to search for an inscription that the lost vagabond Everett Roos might have carved in 1934. The tiniest detail takes on supreme importance. But once the book is published, I usually set that subject aside and move on to my next project. After Devil's Gate, I had no desire to squint at more microfilm in the LDS archives in Salt Lake City, or to hike farther along the Mormon Trail in western Wyoming. After 4 Against the Arctic, I was only too glad that I would never again have to prosecute a search through piles of old, unsorted documents in a dusty Russian library, or trudge through a Svalbard whiteout spooked by invisible polar bears. With In Search of the Old Ones, it was different. The prehistory of the Southwest has gotten under my skin, and I couldn't let go of its mysteries and delights. Virtually every spring and fall since 1996, and several summers and winters, I have returned to the Colorado Plateau and the wilderness surrounding it on all sides to hike and backpack into canyons where yet another mud and stone refuge or visionary pictograph panel might lurk unknown. I've cornered the next generation of archaeologists and begged them to explain their research, and I've gone to conferences where they unveiled their findings via posters and PowerPoint. I've coaxed several of these experts into the field so that we could retrace their theories under our boot soles. I continue to comb what scholars call the gray literature, and a paper titled One-Pot Pithouses and Fremont Paradoxes, or The Kivas of Sama, still enthralls me. Since 1996, I've written some 24 articles, mixing cutting-edge archaeology with my own backcountry adventures, for magazines ranging from National Geographic and Smithsonian to Arizona Highways and El Palacio. It's gratifying that In Search of the Old Ones is still in print, and rewarding to hear the accolades of many of its readers, including a number of Native Americans who I thought would be my most critical audience. But in some senses, the book is out of date. The last 20 years of archaeological research have refuted some of the theories that were widely accepted in 1996, while inserting startling...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?